Evening for everyone watching us from all over the world. We would love to present to you today. We have a very good friend of ours, a new employee to American Eagle, but not new to WordPress and Gutenberg and beautiful world of the CMS systems. We have from the UK, Sean Blakeley. He's our technical director for our WordPress practice here at American Eagle. We are very, very excited to have him in our team. And today we chose to actually ask Sean some questions regarding the latest and greatest from WordPress 5.5 and 5.6 and the future of WordPress, Gutenberg, React, everything that you might think of. So we would love to see your questions also coming in on the stream. I'll be monitoring that as well. And I'd love to actually give you the mic, Sean, to go ahead and introduce yourself. And I can tell you that I'm really excited to have you on the show.
Thanks, Lino. Appreciate that. So, as Lino said, my name is Sean Blakeley. I've been working with WordPress for a long time now, since 2007, so entering my second decade, or well into my second decade. Before American Eagle, I was working as the technical director for one of the UK's largest WordPress agencies, an agency called Pragmatic, and I was actually helping to implement their transition into Gutenberg, and we'll be talking a bit about that a little bit later today. And as Lino said, recently I joined American Eagle as the WordPress technical director. I'm looking forward to the journey that lies ahead with my colleagues at American Eagle.
And we are very excited to have you, Sean.
Thank you.
I'm going to turn on the background screen to show your demo. Is that okay?
That's perfect.
Let's go ahead and do that, boss. It's on. It's all ready to go.
Great stuff. Okay, so today what I thought we'd do is talk about Gutenberg, so where Gutenberg is today, and I'm going to showcase Gutenberg in a moment for those that maybe haven't been exposed to it, haven't seen it, and then we're going to look at where Gutenberg is heading. So it's less than 2 years since Gutenberg landed in the core of WordPress, and when I'm talking about Gutenberg, it's the block editor, what we're calling the sort of new editor for WordPress. So in those 2 years, there's been huge amounts of change that's happened within WordPress and the sort of stabilization of that editor, of the new editor. So let's go and have a look at the block editor, the Gutenberg editor. And so this is the interface. This is where we are today. So we're at WordPress 5.5. So this is the latest version. And as you can see, I can click and add block indicator here. And we get, and in fact, if I browse all, we get a huge selection now, and it certainly wasn't like this in the early days, but we can see a huge selection of blocks here. So we've got our kind of text blocks, which is for adding content, and then we've got our media blocks, so more of an enrichment of that content area, and then we move down into design and widgets, and then we've got lots and lots of embed options for different services. So let's create a couple of quick blocks just to sort of showcase the interface and how this works from a user perspective. So one of my favorites is always the media and text to kind of go to. So if I click on that block, you'll see immediately that it populates the back end of WordPress, so into the sort of editor interface. And you'll see I've got a couple of call to actions already. So I've got this media area call to action with an upload or media library, and then we'll go to the content in a second. So let's find out if I put anything in the media library. Yes, I did, but I tell you what, let's grab a new image. Let's grab this computer. So just while I'm waiting for that download, it doesn't work. So let's go to something that we've already preloaded. Let's go to our nice cat here. So as you can see, it drops the image into this block, and then I'm going to add content here. So this is a block title. And then I can simply, just by pressing return or enter, I can get into a new block field, and this is another block. And by default, this is the paragraph block. And then if I came down and we got that very familiar sort of zebra stripe style design pattern that we see all over the internet. So we can do this very easily in this block. If I come up to here, these are the block controls. So this gives me a few options. We can see an alignment control here, and we've got other sort of vertical alignment controls. I can also pull down some further options, but we have this nice left and right flick for the media and text block. So here we go, and then we're getting that sort of zebra effect. So again, this is title, And I'm going to grab the same cat if we're having an issue with our image uploader. There we go. And what I might do is just navigate to the block and see what our options are. So you can see on the right-hand side, we've got our block attributes. So these are where we can start setting some of those attributes within the blocks themselves. And for this one, I'm going to give it a slightly different background color. So if I drop the background color there we go, it's nice and clear. Now I'm going to publish this post, and then we're just going to go and have a look at the front end. And what you should see, there we go, we can see that we've got those sort of zebra stripes. And I could have made them full width, and there's all sorts of other changes I can make. Now this is quite a revolution within WordPress. So we certainly weren't here a couple of years ago, and we had a very different editing experience. So within WordPress, even 2 years ago, if I move down to some of these, now this is an example of where we were within WordPress. So we were using shortcodes. We were having to put those shortcodes in what essence was just a text area. Now shortcodes were triggered by the square brackets, which we could then call in code blocks that we could then feed parameters in. So we could feed values to those code blocks. It was a really complex way of trying to implement enrichment within this content area. And what we found, and this was kind of the design pattern for many years within WordPress, and what we found is that clients found this very, very difficult, very awkward to use, particularly when shortcodes were trying to get more sophisticated, so you would have multitude of options. And what you'd end up with is the kind of spaghetti code that we've got on the screen in front of us. There were other approaches, and one of the most popular was ACF, and indeed is still very popular. And ACF is a great way of adding data, so adding metadata and giving your data structure within WordPress. Now, that was always its intention. As it evolved, it became more of a sort of page construction or a sort of site construction tool. And we started using ACF for a myriad of different options, all sorts of different features and elements and controls that our clients could have within their site. Now, it always had a major drawback, and that drawback was that it was completely abstracted from the front end. So it was kind of a leap of faith that you'd check a checkbox in ACF in the back end, and it was a leap of faith to kind of hope that somehow something would materialize on the front end and it would persist through. So it always had that, it always sort of suffered from that breakage between the back end experience, the kind of content creation, the site creation experience, and then what would actually persist on the front end. And so this kind of brings us back to that notion of, why did WordPress need this new editor? Why did WordPress need to invest in creating Gutenberg? And there's probably a couple of reasons. So the first one is the one that we've just examined, that we'd kind of fallen behind a lot of content management systems. We'd kind of fallen behind some of the interfaces that were being experimented with, and I think particularly around sort of Wix and Squarespace, maybe the sort of certainly the non-enterprise CMS space. WordPress was losing ground to these WYSIWYG interfaces where people were dragging and dropping entities and elements around the site. And WordPress was, as we've just seen, really a text area that we were kind of dropping shortcodes in, those square brackets to drop in our code blocks. And so clearly we needed to make a change to the interface. And secondly, and this kind of plays out to the Christian Clayton idea around the innovator's dilemma, that WordPress was now dominating the marketplace and still is, and in fact is dominating more than ever. And that you're always in danger of stagnating when you're sort of at the top of a marketplace. You start to become vulnerable to quick, agile innovators, either implementing new software or new ways of working or new challenges and innovations disrupting the marketplace. And so one of the ideas that Christian Clayton brought forward was the innovator's dilemma, where you actually start challenging your own position, challenging from within. And WordPress has done this incredibly successfully, first with the REST API, that dropped into core about 4 years ago or so, and has really enabled a lot of what we're talking about, as well as the enterprise journey that WordPress has been on recently. So the REST API and the introduction of the REST API was hugely successful. And then Gutenberg is of a similar vein, that it's kind of challenging its own dominant position, really forcing through innovation, forcing that kind of change. Sometimes against the desires of some of the community. It hasn't been universally accepted, should we say that? It's been a bumpy road, but it's been a hugely exciting journey that we've been on and continue to sort of go on with Gutenberg. And so there's clear reasons that WordPress decided to go on this journey. Now, in the early days of Gutenberg, it was very challenging. We talked, or I've just mentioned briefly, about some potential resistance from the community, and that was particularly strong in the early days of Gutenberg. So when we're talking about the early days, we're probably talking about 2.5 years ago, maybe just a touch more, maybe 3 years ago, so before it dropped into core. And what we were finding was that it was really buggy. It was a tool. It was a piece of a software that was a paradigm shift within WordPress. We were moving from PHP-based software into a JavaScript-driven, so React-driven part of the WordPress architecture, part of the WordPress platform. And so this was entirely new, not just to the contributors to core, so the actual creators of WordPress and the community that creates WordPress, but also to the whole community of developers. Almost all WordPress developers were PHP developers. That's how they'd learned and understood WordPress. Many WordPress developers are self-taught or have gone on a journey to learn and understand WordPress. And suddenly we had this huge shift, this huge change, where we were introducing not just JavaScript, but React into the very foundation of WordPress, and WordPress developers needed to respond, and it was a big challenge. The other issue that really challenged us as an agency was that things were moving incredibly quickly and things were breaking quickly, and we just weren't used to this in WordPress. Now, one of the sort of principles of WordPress is backwards compatibility, and WordPress has been incredibly diligent about always ensuring backwards compatibility. Now, the reason being is, with the dominant position that WordPress has, with running the 34%, I think, of sites now, or something of that nature, there comes huge responsibility in terms of supporting those millions of sites and the myriad versions and combinations of plugins and versions of WordPress and themes and so on. And so it's always been seen as a huge strength of WordPress to be able to provide that backwards compatibility. But a little for the API, but absolutely for Gutenberg, we break that rule. And so we started breaking things, and we started breaking things quickly. And so what we found is that there was no sweet spot to kind of drop into Gutenberg development, that we would be creating blocks, and the next version, and it might even be a smaller update version of WordPress, but that might be enough to knock our blocks out of functionality. And what we found was that function names would be changing, methodologies, the API for certain features would be changing, as we should expect. But again, this was a learning curve. WordPress, as WordPress developers, we just weren't used to this dynamic. We weren't used to this environment. And I think also it's worth mentioning that we had block libraries. There was a huge growth of block sort of libraries. I think many people were speculating that this was potentially a new marketplace, that Gutenberg was going to introduce a new micro marketplace into WordPress. And anyone that's been in the WordPress community for a while will remember everything was free within WordPress about 10 years ago, for better or for worse. And then we had things like Theme Forest and premium themes coming in, and then it introduced this freemium sort of notion within the WordPress community, and then everything, sort of plugin, premium versions of plugins, and so everything kind of changed and created this marketplace within WordPress hugely successfully. And I think the block libraries was seen as a potential opportunity, a bit of a sort of wild west in terms of not having those dominant players, and were we creating another microeconomy within WordPress? And I think that's kind of still open to debate. I'm not sure we've kind of settled whether that is the case or not. And so for us, these page builders, or these block libraries rather, felt like they were the new page builders. They were kind of introducing potential dependencies to our WordPress stack. As we said, things were moving very quickly. We would then have to be leaning on these block libraries in maybe ways that we didn't want to be doing in the medium to longer term, because we didn't know their development roadmaps. They were also, and again, a bit like themes, as we mentioned, those premium themes, trying to solve all the problems for all the people. They tend to get quite bloated. There'd be all sorts of options there. And so we kind of rejected them as the new page builders, and a little bit derogatory there, but as a kind of dependency that we wanted to avoid. Now, interestingly, that was potentially a mistake. And what I'd like to talk about is maybe some of those early mistakes that we made. And in fact, I'll show you in a second some of the things that we did. So, as I say, we weren't kind of clear what the trajectory of Gutenberg was. We were all kind of learning this new technology, this new way of implementing content and creating content within WordPress. And we undoubtedly made some early mistakes. Now, let me show you maybe just a couple of those. So one of the first things we were kind of thinking about was we were really concerned about the sort of flexibility, the freedom that Gutenberg created for content creators. And that concern came from the clients themselves. So our clients were saying that, it's a powerful tool, but we don't necessarily want our content team to be able to create any combination of these blocks. We want to lock certain things down, or we want to start focusing only on certain blocks and not enabling others, which kind of took us down this road of opting in, which in hindsight was the wrong way around and was an error. So what we did was that, sort of with our custom use, you can see here with this piece of code, what we're doing is we've just got a switch case here where we've got post types, and what we're actually doing is opting in to some of the core blocks. Now, I wouldn't recommend this. I think this is the wrong way around. Thinking of opting out by default, so kind of no blocks are switched on, and then you go methodically through and switch the blocks on, made sense in one of our early implementations, but the outcome was that simple things didn't work because we hadn't predicted it. And I think that the best example was we hadn't dropped, and you probably see here, for example, we hadn't dropped list. So we hadn't thought to drop the list block into our podcast. Now, such a seemingly simple piece of user interface to create a bullet point list, and yet because we hadn't thought of it and we hadn't opted in, the user wasn't able to create that. And this was echoed and repeated a number of times. And so we clearly needed to shift from that opt-in to an opt-out. And so what we then moved to was just disabling the odd block sort of here and there. So that was one of our first issues. Then we found that just the complexity, and I'm talking in terms of the code, the amount of code that we were writing, which in turn, of course, results in code management and increased time for the support desk and the rest of the production team and so on. There were huge amounts of, just in terms of volume, kind of the learning curve that we were going on, our understanding of what we needed to do to manipulate and create Gutenberg blocks in the way that we needed to at the time. And if I show you, this is going to go on for 200 odd. Are we going to even hit the 300 mark? Not quite. So if I show you what this is creating, so we've got close to 300 lines of code, and this is all that area is creating. So it's just creating 3 panels of recent speaking engagements. Now, again, this was part of our learning curve that we hadn't necessarily thought about or understood how we could bring core blocks in to start doing some of that heavy lifting for us. We were looking at sort of custom first. That was our understanding of the sort of design requirements or the build requirements for Gutenberg, and we weren't utilizing what was available to us. And this was something that we moved on to, and we'll talk about in a second. And there was the other issue that it presented to us is that we didn't have the sort of joined up project lifecycle and the knowledge that we were building up in that full project lifecycle. So what we found is that our developers were on a sort of fast track to learning, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But we're sort of fast tracking their learning. So simply by being involved and deep diving into Gutenberg, they were sort of developing their skills and their different methodology for tackling the problems. That wasn't persisting into our support desk, and so projects were kind of landing in our support desk, and they just didn't have that experience. They didn't have that knowledge, and so we very quickly had to provide knowledge and training within our support desk to ensure that we had that kind of rounded knowledge and ability across the agency for the full life cycle of the project. And there were a few other things as well. We were playing with the rich text block. We were struggling with some of the different ways of constructing blocks. Equally, and this was in the early days, this is less of an issue now, but our front-end developers were really struggling because blocks often came with a myriad of different attributes and attributes. If I still have this open, if I go to Edit Post, I can show you the attributes. So these are the attributes that sit I have to select a block that sit down the right hand side. So these attributes drop into the database, and we can then utilize these and use them as our display functionality, or indeed whatever we need to. And the front enders are really struggling with these. In the early days, there would be lots of options here, padding and margin and all sorts of colors, but there also might be font options. And so front enders couldn't decide how to implement this and how we could allow for all these different combinations or potential combinations. What we also found was that this was challenging our assumptions and our sort of working methodology. So where before we'd moved from static design, so we'd have our designers working in Sketch or whatever their software of choice was, they'd be working on those static designs, we'd get the sign-off. We'd then go to the front enders. They'd implement that interactive design, that interactive implementation, and then that would get signed off as kind of the definition of the project. Well, that was starting to break down because we didn't have those template designs that were then being implemented, pixel perfect implementations, and then pushed into a live site. Clients were increasingly talking about a block library, and I don't mean block library in terms of sort of atomic blocks or such like. I mean their own design system, their own design library. We started having clients using this language back to us as, we want the toolbox, we want the toolkit of components, and we want to start building out from there. And so that challenged this notion of a static, pixel perfect sort of template, and challenged it in a really positive way as well. I mean, these were ideation and conceptual challenges which made for really interesting, exciting conversations between these different stakeholders, these different participants. This touched the designers, the front enders, the back enders, the clients themselves, and so there's lots of interesting conversations as we tried to understand and improve the processes here. There was also a conversation around where do blocks live? I mean, where do they actually belong? So within WordPress, we've got our two sort of, we don't adhere to a MVC or other kind of design pattern. But what we do have is themes and plugins as ways of kind of bringing external code into the core and extending and expanding on WordPress functionality. Now, there was a number of questions about, well, where do blocks live in that paradigm? And should they persist in the theme? And are they coupled and deeply coupled to the themes? Or indeed, is this a content function and feature, and should it then be theme agnostic and it kind of sits outside? So again, these conversations are really interesting ones to have. I think most of these have been resolved as a community. But they were certainly challenging when you're trying to understand how you push Gutenberg into your workflow. So while we're kind of talking about building blocks. I thought maybe we could just have a quick look, and we might just quickly build a block, and I'll show you how easy and simple it is to build a Gutenberg block now. So there were, in the early days, some real challenges in terms of how to build a block. There's a lot of scaffolding, a lot of packages that we have dependencies for building out our sort of Babel and ES6, and so on and so forth. So there's lots of scaffolding involved. Now, thankfully, that's all been abstracted away, and there are now a few build tools available. So I think Web Dev Studios have fairly recently built one, and I know the core team have now released one, but probably the most common and the most popular still is something called Create Gutenberg Blocks. So if I come into, let's open up my terminal, there we are, and I have already CD'd into the plugin folder. So if I can remember NPX, which is just a cached version of NPM, create Gutenberg block, and let's call it Twitch example. Why not? There we go. And so hopefully this is just going to pull in those dependencies, those packages that I mentioned a moment ago. It's going to be building out all the different scaffolding and architecture that we need for our block. And not just that, what it's actually going to do is create us a WordPress plugin. So it's all kind of wrapped up and self-contained. It's going to create an example block for us, and we'll go and have a look at that in a second. But we could also drop in multiple blocks into this plugin, and it will build them on its own build cycle, on the same build cycle, and then we can implement them into our site. So hopefully these packages won't take too much longer, and what I'll do is pull this into an example site. There we go. So let's CD into our Twitch example. Beautiful. And then I'm just going to start watching the files. So this will just keep us watching and making sure that we're compiling at runtime. And let me go to our plugins. And if I refresh here, we should see, there we go, Twitch example. I'm just working on a multi-site here just for no particular reason, just as an example. And so we can now go to any post, but let me go to, let's create a new post here. To add a new post. And then I'm going to go back to my block selector, and what I'm looking for, if I browse all, there we go, I've got my Twitch example, so my new block that we just created together. Now if I click here, I'm going to see a message saying hello from the back end. If I publish this, and spoiler alert, I think you might know what's going to happen, but if we go to the front, there we go, hello from the front end. And that's a Gutenberg block. So it's a very simple Gutenberg block, but it is a Gutenberg block nonetheless. And what it's done is abstracted away a lot of the challenges to creating a block. Now, let me see if I can find it. So it's our Twitch example. Here we go. Tell you what I could do, actually. Let's come out of this and let's open it in a code editor. And so, as we can see, it's a pretty simple implementation. It's a pretty simple plugin, but there's a lot of dependencies, a lot of packages up here. And we've got our block.js file, which then calls the function, the register block type function, and registers our block with the various parameters that it requires. And then you can see that these two functions, these key functions, and we're going to return to these a little later, but you'll see edit, which is what is the back end. That's the editing experience. So this is us rendering and returning that data to the back end. And then the save function, which is where we're saving out the content and presenting it on the front end. And so you'll see that that's we've got that differential with the front end. So that's a basic Gutenberg block. Let me come back to moving through some of the other issues that we kind of face. So as an agency, we had, and I mentioned this a moment ago, but we had some clear gaps in our knowledge, and it went beyond just Gutenberg, there were some fundamental sort of knowledge gaps around the technical stack and the technologies that were now being implemented. And so what we developed was a strategy to tackle those knowledge gaps and really sort of propel us forward into the new WordPress tech stack. And there were three things that we thought were absolutely key. So the first was training. Obviously, we need to provide that training. I mentioned that we had the shortcoming within the support team, so we knew that this had to be across the development team, both in terms of production, but also in terms of the support desk. We also looked at providing guidelines, so evaluating our ways of working and providing guidelines. And then finally, tools. And providing the developers with some tools. So just looking at those specifically for a moment, the training we kind of split into three. And so it was clear that we needed to build up our confidence with JavaScript and learn JavaScript deeply. So we encouraged the developers to learn ES6, tackle ES6 first. And we found that Stephen Gridder tutorials were really helpful for that in terms of upskilling the team and getting to understand modern JavaScript. And then with React, again, I think it was Stephen Gridder. We tried a few different training courses, but that seemed to be the one that resonated with the team and helped to galvanize some of those key concepts. And the reason that we started there before we'd even stepped into Gutenberg and into the Gutenberg interface is that, or the sort of build method, is that there's lots of React in Gutenberg. There's lots of core concepts that really you can't build, or you're building Gutenberg blocks blind if you don't understand some of these key concepts within React. And so we found that this really was, we needed to put those building blocks, those knowledge kind of building blocks in place first before we could then move on to get some deeper Gutenberg knowledge. And our intention was, so we'd go through that ES6 learning, we'd move on to React. And then our intention was probably Zach Gordon, a specific Gutenberg course. And we had Zach come and join us for a workshop or two. But what we found was that once we built that knowledge, once we were confident with ES6, once we were confident with React, it was then practical learning. That's the best way that we developed our Gutenberg expertise, was doing it within production and actually doing it within live sites. So it created some issues around, we created some specialists, so people that were more exposed to Gutenberg started building knowledge much quicker than other parts of the team. And so they'd have more pressure on them around, sort of questions and requirements and the rest of the team. But it was a good way to sort of upskill collectively and to assist the agency to make that transition into Gutenberg. So that was the training. With the guidelines and the ways of working, it was trying to move away from that temptation to always create custom blocks. That was our kind of first approach, that we would always create a custom block. And we tried to sort of pull back from that and to qualify when we should be creating a custom block and when we should be leaning harder on maybe block libraries or other. We'll talk about other approaches in a moment. And also we try to define when to lean on ACF. So the issue with advanced custom fields that has a build process for blocks, the only issue is it kind of breaks the WYSIWYG experience. So you're broken out of the WYSIWYG experience as you go into the ACF block editing interface, and then you sort of click out of that and you're back into the WYSIWYG experience. So we tried to minimize that breakage of the content creation experience as much as we could, but it's so much quicker to implement, so much quicker than than custom blocks, that we did try and define when that was the best approach. And then finally, tooling. And so we looked at providing some internal tools, and one of the key assets that we created was a collection of UI components. So we looked at these block libraries, we found them quite bloated and really sort of too big for our specific use case. And so we considered these UI components like sort of agency blocks. They were the building blocks that we would then be repurposing across multiple sites. So we really wanted them to be style agnostic. We didn't have any styling on them, and I'll show you them in a second. We didn't have any styling there at all. And we just wanted them to be tackling sort of foundational challenges, and then the actual site, the implementation, the theme would be sort of picking up the rest. And so they really were just those base building blocks, building tenants of enabling us to have that sort of core functionality, essentially repeating tasks, tasks that we would be building across multiple sites. We tried to push into these agency blocks, into these UI components. So let me show you those components now. I think I have enabled them somewhere. Let me come into this multi-site, and here we are, UI components. Let's go and create a post in here. So if I add new, and I'll show you the back end in a second, but if I click to add a block here, yes, there we go. So you can see we've got our UI sort of library here, and this was, we did some research about the sites that we built, so probably nigh on sort of 12, 18 months. We did a sort of analysis of some of the designs, the implementations, the functionality that we've done, and then we translated those into things that we would recognize as React components or UI components, and then started to create those blocks. Let me show you probably one of my favorites, which is content grid here. So this enables us to add content. Let me create a tile. Let me go to the media library. So it allows us to create that really common design pattern that we see. Oh, there we are, a lovely cat here. That really common design pattern that we see repeating over and over again, where we have kind of sort of three panels side by side. Often it might be the latest posts. Often in this example, it's going to be hand curated content. So let's put content here. And then I'm simply, and you can see the additional block indicator there, so I'm going to create another tile, and hopefully these images are the same kind of size. Let's put another title, and again content, and then I'll create a third one just so we can see how this works, and let's get another cat in there. There we go. A third title, and for no great reason I'm going to put content. These, incidentally, this is a linking icon, which let's put a hash in there just to wake the link up, but it's an optional to make these linkable. So let me publish that, and I can already see that we've got slight wonky alignment, so that'll be sort of my code, no doubt, in my block, but let's see how that displays. So there we are. So it's not persisting on the front end, and we've got these nice three panels, and I could be adding other elements to this and throwing other things into our grid. We might do this. We can create a slightly different programmatically driven grid where we're showing the latest content, or even search results. We could populate into what's called a dynamic block, so we can run a query and then sort of pull that content from the database. But in this instance, this is where you have those kind of three tiles that might be side by side. So let me go back to the into the content, into this block itself, because as we can see, we've got these attributes. So these are our block attributes, and what we found really useful is where sites have that sort of differential. They might be display of 3 items side by side, or 4, or they might be slightly different grids, and so this single block would allow us to start manipulating that grid, and just with the ease of a slider we can start changing those grid dynamics. We can also do it at smaller sizes, so if I was to make this site, this page smaller, then you would start seeing these other columns and these other breakpoints in different columns. So we found these building blocks really useful, and they were sort of the core building blocks that we repurposed across a number of sites. Let me show you. So this is a good example. This is a site that's built with these blocks. So these were the sort of the base building blocks that we utilized, and then as we kind of move down, you can see this is probably exactly what I've just shown you. Will be a grid of tiles. And you can see the styling, takes them into a completely separate user experience. And so it's entirely different for the user, the end user, but actually the core code, the sort of build functionality is identical. And it's actually what we've implemented and we've just looked at. So moving to another sort of finding that we had with those UI components. In fact, let me dive momentarily. Let's go into the back of those UI components, and you can see what makes those up. So we've got, not dissimilar to creating the block that we saw a moment ago, we can see our build files here. So we've got our node modules, and then as we move into the file, you can see that we've got this separation of concerns where we've got our different UI components, and you might recognize most of these that we just saw on the interface within the back of WordPress itself. And I can go to, what did we look at? We were looking at content grid. So if I go to content grid, and you can see this, again, this separation of concerns. We've got our index file, which is just declaring those values. What I might do, let's jump into the attributes momentarily, because this is where we declare those columns. So we saw our sort of column slider, we saw our mobile columns, and then we've got our alignment. So we might be declaring, defining it as the block as wide or full, and so on. And so we found these to be a really valuable sort of jumping off point for creating blocks, for creating our sites, and using these as the sort of scaffolding for creating sites. Now, what we also experimented with is that we were, from those early learnings that we were talking about, where we had the kind of rich text block, and everything was kind of custom, and we were, it was a long development time to produce sometimes even a single block, and we saw that sort of near 300 odd lines of code for doing something that was relatively simple. So what we started experimenting with was what we called composite blocks. Now, composite blocks, and I think, let's go to a tile, actually, because the tile was what we were looking at a moment ago. So if I go to tile and I go to the edit, what we should see is, if I open it in the editor, what we should see is, here we go. So we're declaring a constant, which is template, and that template is actually pulling in blocks. So it's what we used to call a sort of block composite. So it's pulling in core blocks and actually constructing a new block from those core blocks. And we saw it a moment ago where we were uploading an image, we were inserting our title, and then we had a little paragraph block underneath. So this was that notion of composite blocks, where we're sort of creating what we were starting to think of as components, and using blocks, using the core blocks as our atoms, as a kind of atomic design system. And this was kind of our approach. Now, interestingly, and this brings us bang up to date and brings us to the latest sort of implementation of WordPress, so WordPress 5.5. The most important thing and the most notable thing that's landed in WordPress 5.5 is block patterns. Now, block patterns are an echo of exactly that approach. So what we used to think of as composite blocks, these bringing these different blocks together and putting them into a template, well, actually has now been implemented into core. And through core, it's called block patterns. And so let's create a block pattern. And what we'll see is the kind of similarities, but also simplifying that process. So what I'm going to do is, let's create something a bit more complicated. So I'm going to create a couple of columns here, and let's bring in a tile. So we've seen this tile before. Actually, let's not upload. Let's see if we've got any images in this media library. This is better. Yes. Let's go for beautiful landscape. There we go. And then we can put, this is our title, and then again content, and here let's just put a simple button for expediency, and this is a button. Excellent. Okay, so let's publish this block, not for any particular reason. We don't actually need to, but I've just published that because what we're going to do now is go to the source code. Now, if you've had a look at this and use the code editor within Gutenberg, what you'll see is that this is actually how WordPress creates blocks in the back end. So we're using HTML comments to then sort of as our construction flags for Gutenberg and for blocks. Now, what I want to do is copy this output, and then I need to escape these values. And so you can use any tool, although I tend to use this one. So this is onlinestringtools.com, and I drop my string in, and then I can see it's escaped here, so it's escaped my values. So I just want to copy this output, and what I have already done is created the simplest of plugins. So let me go to this simple plugin. Let me just briefly tell you what it's doing. So we've created a function here, a register block patterns. We're then checking whether the register block pattern function is available to us. If it is, and so we can create a block pattern, then we're registering our block. And it's very simply that we're giving it the location, and we're dropping in our array with a title, and this is where we're going to drop our escaped string. So this is our value. I'm going to copy and paste it in there, and this is now, I can go back to the beginning, this is now our content and the content of our block pattern. So let's save this and go back into our WordPress implementation. I'm hoping that if we go back, let's create a new post just to make things nice and clean. I want to go back into the visual editor. It's going to get very complicated. So if we click on add a block, well, you'll see that next to adding a block is patterns and the opportunity to add patterns. So this is those block patterns that we talked about and that have landed in 5.5. So if I click on block patterns, you'll see that we've got a couple of patterns here coming through from our theme, and I might talk about theme in a moment. We've also got some core block patterns, but if I scroll to the bottom, hopefully what we're going to find, yes, there we go. So this is the example that we've just created, and if I click on it, there's my block pattern. So it's as simple as that, and so I have the opportunity to start creating this content within the WordPress interface, this kind of block pattern that I can then repurpose and reuse, and I can start editing this now and changing it, and it's using that block pattern as the template. So this is now a unique implementation of that block pattern. Now that workflow is a little clumsy, and having to go out into the escaping tool is a little tedious. So thankfully, Justin Tadlock has created an excellent little plugin which kind of takes away some of this pain for us. So if I come back to, we can leave this page, and let me go right back up to the network admin of the site, and let's see, have we got, yes, there we are, there's Justin's plugin. So I'm going to enable it across the network, and then just for neatness, let's go back to our block patterns, and we can see here we've got a new custom post type called patterns, and if I click on new pattern, then I can create my new pattern here, and let's keep it nice and simple. So let's just seemingly go to block, which is the tile, and we've got a title for block pattern, and then I can publish this entry sort of here, and then what we'll find again, if we go to a new post, this will become available to me through this block patterns interface, assuming I did actually save that. And so if we come through here and we can see block patterns, we should see, I'm not sure I actually saved it, but if I did, yes I did, there we go. So we can now reuse this and repurpose this. So a much simpler interface, and I would really recommend utilising Justin Tadlock's plugin there for making block patterns really easy and really straightforward. Now for me, the the creation of block patterns is absolutely critical, and it's really sort of brought the galvanized, I think, the sort of interpretation of what we can do with Gutenberg and how we're going to implement Gutenberg. So I mentioned a moment ago that we were thinking in terms of those composite blocks. We were thinking in terms of the atomic design patterns and how we can use core as those atoms, and that we create block patterns are really our composites. They are our components. Now, increasingly, we're looking at creating block patterns as the sort of component library for our clients. That's where the uniqueness, where the efforts are going into in terms of their UI toolkit and toolbox. And so this has been hugely valuable for us, and we're still experimenting and looking at how we can further kind of utilize this opportunity. But I think it's a huge change within a hugely positive change within the toolkit that we have within WordPress. And then I'm mindful of time. I know we're still okay for time, because there's a couple of other things that I wanted to talk about.
We have about 5 minutes, Sean, but I also have a couple of questions as well. So we can ask them now, or we can wait until you talk about tomorrow and the future of all that stuff. You're more than welcome to do that as well.
I tell you what, give me 3 minutes to rattle through this as quick as I can, and then we'll do some questions at the end. So look, tomorrow, well, we have the opportunity within WordPress. You have the opportunity to sort of fast track and actually see what's coming down the pipeline in terms of the development sort of cycle, because within WordPress we can enable the Gutenberg plugin. Again, let me go to the plugins area within our network, and you can see here we've got the Gutenberg plugin. So this is the development plugin, so like the sort of nightlies, if you like, and adds the very latest sort of work within Gutenberg and work within WordPress. Now, what I've done, because it didn't seem to be multi-site compatible, I've moved this into a separate site. But this really is the bleeding edge of where WordPress and where Gutenberg is going. Now, what you'll find, in fact, let me come out of here momentarily and have a quick look into Gutenberg, because you can see that there are some experiments going on for 5.6, and the most important of which is the full site editing experience. So this is really bringing to sort of galvanizing that notion that Gutenberg is going to control the whole interface, and starting to think about those a shift in terms of not just a content creation. So we're not just restricted to the sort of section that sits in between the header and the footer, or the header and the colophon. What we're actually going to be able to control is the whole interface. So that's bringing in the header, bringing in the footer, bringing in the sidebar if you have one. I'm really looking at that whole editing experience. For some developers, it may be that they have used Customizer for some of those areas in the past. Well, this is now bringing it into the WordPress, into the Gutenberg domain. Equally, even menus and navigation is now coming into Gutenberg and being controlled by the block experience. So I encourage you to have a look, to download the Gutenberg plugin to enable these experimental sides. They're in live development, so they'll be constantly changing. But what you'll see is the beginnings, and it really is the very beginnings, but it's an opportunity to start editing site-wide elements. So we can see here, what have I got? I've got an H1 block, so I'm going to remove block. You can see I'm in a header block. So if I come down to the bottom here, you can see I'm actually in a template part, and I'm in the header. And so if I come here, and I know that we now have a number of different blocks available to us, one of which is site logo. And so I'm going to upload the American Eagle logo. Of course I am. And there we go. And so I can start bringing that logo in. If I move that above the navigation, and maybe I want to centralize it. So already you can see that I'm starting to build a header. This could be a site-wide header. I'm also have the opportunity to edit different templates. So maybe I want to edit the archive, and this is again something that we've not really been able to do, or not been able to do conveniently, is to edit those archive pages. And so this is coming into the site-wide editor as well. So huge potential here, huge potential to really enable users to have more control over their site. It comes with deep concerns around, with great power comes great responsibility, and are we providing too much opportunity for causing too many issues? If the designers have designed a specific site with a different, the specific visual language and sort of rhythm down the page, and here we are kind of breaking and destroying that. So it definitely, it needs careful consideration, but it really does open up the opportunity to be approaching WordPress and thinking about WordPress in terms of bringing everything into the back end, into this interface, which then enables us to start breaking down our notions of what a theme is and what the theme needs to be doing. What I've got here is the Seedlet, which is the Automatic's new experimental theme. This is the using blocks really as the absolute core, as the building blocks of this theme. And we've got really very little that sits within the theme other than these static HTML files, and it is just leading on the block editor, and we're controlling things by CSS variables, and so we can cascade things from the child site back through the whole sort of architecture. There's lots more to talk about. I could talk about the block directory. I could be talking about some other things, but I appreciate time is running very light. And Lino, you said there was a question or two.
Yes,
I'd love to get to questions.
I enjoyed it very much, Sean. You did a great job, and it is amazing. This is not the same WordPress that I used several years ago. It's definitely not your grandpa's WordPress, that's for sure. So this is awesome. My main question is, if you're a JavaScript developer or a React developer, how successful can you be working on WordPress? And by meaning this question, do you also need to know PHP to be successful working with WordPress, or is it enough for you to be a React developer, and then you can have a PHP developer on the site itself that can actually take your work and with patterns and so on? Do you absolutely have to have also PHP knowledge to be successful with that?
Absolutely not. Definitely not. So we went through a bumpy patch where you kind of needed PHP and you needed your JavaScript hat, and then we had this difficult sort of quandary where we really needed full stack developers for the first iteration or two of Gutenberg. That's absolutely not the case now. What we've seen with the REST API introduction 3 or 4 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago now, is that increasingly we're seeing headless WordPress implementation. So what we often now see is the separation of concerns. So you've got very much your back-enders that would be creating that heavy lifting, integrations and so on within PHP. But then we've got our front-end engineers doing the front end, ingesting that data from the REST API, displaying that within React components. We've experimented with Gatsby and other sort of implementations, but the same kind of principle is there of ingesting that data. There's a very mature implementation as well of GraphQL within WordPress, and so that's hugely empowering at the moment. That developers that are coming from a React world, that are coming from a non-WordPress world, well, actually, WordPress has kind of opened its doors in terms of providing data and providing in a clear, structured way. With GraphQL, you can actually start defining your data model, and so huge.
And also, Sean, I wanted to ask also, because this also comes up a lot, because it's open source and we have access to the plumbing that actually makes WordPress works with React. Is it possible for somebody that wants to do the plumbing to allow Angular and Vue developers to build it, or is it very specific to React, or the plumbing can be done for Vue and Angular developers to be able to play in the game as well?
So I would say categorically yes, in terms of a decoupled front end. Then you can build it in whatever you require and whatever your technology of choice is, because you really are just ingesting data and using WordPress as a data service, really. And you've got those API interfaces and the GraphQL. Gutenberg is coupled to React, so if you wanted to go into the build process, so into Gutenberg itself, that is a React interface. There's been talk of potentially some other becoming a bit more sort of language agnostic. Equally, there are. Gutenberg has been pulled out of WordPress, and interestingly, I know there's some projects where it's been pulled into Drupal. and to some other platforms. So that's an interesting exercise as well, that actually Gutenberg has been decoupled from WordPress. And so, it's interesting to think about how it's interacting with the sort of technology stack at the moment. But Gutenberg is React. However, WordPress is definitely can be used across.
Sean, I can't thank you enough. This has been a valuable hour. I'm going to be putting that video definitely on the American Eagle YouTube channel so everybody can actually see it as well. But I want to thank you for your time and your knowledge, and hopefully we can get you back again on Eagle TV to explain some other things that WordPress and React developers might be very interested in the future as well. Thank you, Sean.
Absolute pleasure, Lionel. I'd love to come back, and thank you to anyone who's watching. It's been a pleasure to be here today.
Thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.